Gilgal was the first place which Israel went when they entered into the Promised Land. When Israel came to Gilgal, they set up a monument comprised of 12 stones. Each of these 12 stones symbolized one of the tribes of Israel. These stones at Gilgal were meant to remind the Israelites of how God rolled over the shame of their enslavement in Egypt. So you could say that Gilgal was akin to the Statue of Liberty in America today. It was a place of national liberation, not just from foreign oppressors, but also from foreign gods. So if this is such a powerful symbol and testament to Israel's civil and religious liberty, why do we find foreign idols where this monument stands in the story of Ehud? Today we're going to walk through the story of the first assassin in the Bible. I like to call him Ehud the Unifier. In this story, we are very briefly informed that Ehud walked by, quote, the idols at Gilgal, unquote. We have no other stories in the Bible which talk about any idols being set up at this monument of national pride. But for some reason, it is in this moment in Ehud's story, when he sees the idols at Gilgal, that he seems to go through with his plan to start a coup. What was going through the mind of this assassin, and what can we learn from these strange idols at Gilgal? Today we're going to explore the beliefs, aims, and motives behind the Bible's first assassin. Today we're going to explore this assassin's creed. Here we go. Now, before I jump into the story of Ehud, I'd like to go over the story just before Ehud and talk briefly about the first sheriff or judge in Israel, and that is Othniel. I know we actually talked about Othniel last time, but he comes up twice in Judges, actually. First, when he captures Kirjath Sefer, or Scroll City, as I like to call it. Then, Othniel comes up again here in chapter 3, right before the story of Ehud. That is where I'd like to start our time today, because not only does Othniel's story set the context for Ehud, he also prepares us for the rest of the judges to come. So let's start in Judges chapter 3, and we'll start in verse 1. Now these are the nations which Yahweh allowed to remain, to test Israel by them. That is, all who had not formerly known any of the wars of Canaan. Only God tested them, and whether the generations of the sons of Israel would know by learning war, especially those who had not formerly known. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived in Mount Lebanon from Mount Baal Hermon as far as the entrance of Hamath. And they were for testing Israel, to know if they would hear the commandments of Yahweh, that he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. Now the sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Thus the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh and forgot Yahweh their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Then the anger of Yahweh burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. And the sons of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. Then the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh raised up a savior for the sons of Israel to save them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he judged Israel. And he went out to war, and Yahweh gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into his hands. So the hand was strong against Cushan Rishathaim. Then the land was quiet for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Okay, there's a few things to note here. First of all, you may be wondering how there's still Canaanites living with Israel. Last time I mentioned how Joshua was about Israel's conquest in the land of Canaan, and in that time, Israel is said to conquest Canaan, right? But we can clearly see here that they did not fully conquer all of the people groups. In fact, there are many groups of people that were said to be completely destroyed in Joshua, yet they will still run around and interact with Israel in later stories throughout the Bible. So even well after the conquest, you can see in stories in Judges and in Samuel and in later books that some of those people groups are still living and they're still alive and well. And it's also worth noting that at first glance, this seems like the authors are moving us forward in time after the conquest of Joshua. After all, we're talking about the nations that Yahweh did not allow to be driven out from the land. But notice how the authors are careful to tell us that God left these nations unconquered to test the generations of the sons of Israel by learning war, especially those who had not formerly known war. I think this implies that there were generations who did know war. So the authors are telling us that every generation of Israel that we are presented with in this book is tested by war. And especially those later generations, presumably the ones who lived after the conquest under Joshua, who had not formerly known war, are being tested by God, leaving hostile enemies in the promised land. Then we're given a judge, Othniel, whom we've already mentioned, lived during the time of Joshua, during the conquest of the land of Canaan. So he did know war, right? Joshua lived with his brother Caleb and conquested the land in the book of Joshua, right? So he grew up with that generation. I know that Caleb could have outlived Joshua for a long time. Here that would have to be like 48 years. My point here is that the authors are careful to note that this trial by war is especially for the generations that did not grow up knowing wars or conquest in this book, which I think implies that there could be generations that grew up knowing war via the first conquest of the land of Canaan under Joshua in this book of Judges. And indeed, Othniel, the first judge presented to us, falls into that category of an Israelite who went through the conquest of the land of Canaan under his brother Joshua and still had to go through the test of war again. I hope that makes sense. I also want to note the language that the authors use here. They say that Israel would know by learning war. What does it mean to know? Like, know what? And how does war teach them this knowing? Well, I think the implication of the word to know here is to have intimacy and trust with Yahweh. The Hebrew word yada is the word translated here as to know, and it can denote both mental understanding of something, but also it can oftentimes denote relationally knowing someone. It has been pointed out to me by a lot of scholars and preachers over the years that the word yada in Hebrew can even be used to describe people having sexual relations throughout the Bible. So right away we see that one of the major lessons that Judges is trying to teach us through these bloody stories is to know God through the wars that they go through. In other words, this is telling us why Judges is going to be so graphic, because God wants his people to know him through warfare and through difficult times. I find this is really, strange. A little ironic, I guess, because though I've never been to war, I've heard the phrase war is hell many times before. I don't doubt that phrase to be true. But at the same time, I can definitely understand what the authors are saying here. I can definitely understand how warfare, oppression, the clashing of cultures can result in a test. And if you pass that test, you can come out on the other side somehow closer to God. We can also gain some wisdom and better know God if we are willing to hear these lessons and learn from the judges who met God not in the pulpit or in nature or through reading their Bibles, but rather on the battlefield, through oppression, through struggle and adversity, and everything that comes with war. So now I'd also like to talk about the villain of this story, Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. What a mouthful. This name is almost as good as Adonai Bezek. But unlike Lord Lightning's name, I think Cushan's name is more than just a cool villain name. I think that his name has some important meaning and significance to Othniel's story. Okay, so Cushan Rishathaim roughly translates to Cushan Double-Trouble, king of Aram of the double rivers. Cushan comes from the word Cush, which was the name for the country that in biblical times was in modern-day Ethiopia. Cushan, however, does not seem to be from Cush. Rather, I think that this was simply a name. It would be akin to someone naming their child today America or Asia. Right? Like he's named after a region, but he's not really from that region. Rishathaim means something like twice or double evil. I like to translate this as double trouble. So his first name means something like Cushan Double-Trouble. All right, so what about the other half of his name, Aram Naharaim? Well, Aram was a region in northwest Mesopotamia. Naharaim means something like two rivers, or double rivers. So when you put this whole name together, it is something like Cushan Double-Trouble, king of Aram of the double rivers. It should be noted here that, like Lord Lightning, Cushan's name was most likely an epitaph or a title or a nickname. Cushan Double-Trouble, I think, was something akin to a nickname like Blackbeard, or for all my SpongeBob fans out there, Dirty Dan or Pinhead Larry. Now, what about Aram Naharaim? Why would the authors choose such a specific term to denote Aram? Why not just say Cushan, the king of Aram, right? Well, anytime in the Bible there's a specific or an odd name, it's always helpful to take a concordance and look up all the times that this odd term was used. The term Aram Naharaim, interestingly, only surfaces 3 other times in the Bible, and each appearance gives us a deeper understanding into the symbolism of this place. So, the first time Aram Naharaim is used is in Genesis 24, and that is when Abraham sends his servant to look for a wife for his son Isaac, not from the Canaanites, but from his own kin. Abraham's servant ventures to Aram Naharaim, where God leads him to Rebekah, a relative of Abraham. I should note here that the 2 main characters from Aram Naharaim in Genesis 24 are Rebekah and her brother Lavan. Both of these characters use trickery and to deceive their family members. They're both tricksters and deceptive characters. Rebekah devises a plan to trick her husband Isaac into giving the family blessing to her favorite son Jacob. And Lavan tricks his new nephew Jacob into marrying both of his daughters, not just Rachel, the one that Jacob really originally wanted to marry that he really loved. So these 2 characters, Rebekah and Lavan, immediately link Aram Naharaim to both family and deceit and trickery. Okay, that's the first time. What is the next time that Aram Naharaim comes up? Next time it comes up is in Deuteronomy 23. Moses warns the Israelites against associating with the Moabites and the Ammonites, and then he reflects back on this very infamous man from Aram Naharaim. This guy's name was Balaam. That name may sound familiar to you. Balaam, back in the book of Numbers, tried to curse Israel, but every time he opened up his mouth to curse God's people, he could only utter blessings for them. So the fact that Balaam in Deuteronomy 23 is later said to be from Aram Naharaim ties this place again to deception and trickery, because it is almost like Balaam is playing the role of accuser in that story. It's like he's trying to take Yahweh to court and convince him to curse Israel. And later on, before that story, Israel messes up a whole bunch of times and God sends all these plagues on them. But as soon as Balaam, this like famous sorcerer and prophet, this famous prophet, tries to take God to court, God's like, no, I'm not going to curse my people. So in one sense, Balaam is playing the role of Rebekah, who has also tried to take the blessing away from one child and give it to another. Balaam, however, in a slightly different way, is trying to convince God to not take a singular person's blessing in favor away, but rather he's trying to argue for taking the nation of Israel's blessing away. So Balaam connects Aram Naharaim to both trickery, but also curses and blessings. Okay, those are the 2 times Aram Naharaim comes up. It comes up one more time. The last time it comes up is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 19, where there's a king of the Ammonites named Hanun. Hanun doesn't hail from Aram Naharaim, but he is associated with this region in the story in Chronicles. So Hanun instigates a conflict with King David by shaming some of David's men who are sent to make peace with his nation. Hanun actually does a kind of like pulls a prank on them. He shaves the men's heads and exposes their butts, their backsides. A pretty petty move, in my opinion. Then after shaming David's men, Hanun hires soldiers from Aram Naharaim to fight Israel's army. I should mention here that Hanun's name means something like grace. His name is the masculine form of the name Hannah, in Hebrew, which also means grace or favor. Hanun's father, his father's name is Nachash, and Nachash is a really important king in my opinion. Nachash's name is the Hebrew word for snake. I actually don't know why most translations don't translate his name, but he's literally King Snake. More him in the Samuel series. So this makes Hanun the son of the snake, or you could say that he is the seed of the serpent. See where I'm going here with this? Apparently, David was on good relations with Hanun's father, but when he tries to make peace with the son or the seed of the snake, his men are shamed and their nakedness is exposed, just like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And then afterwards, David has to go to war with the son of the snake. So yet again, there's another character who should be on good relationships with Israel, who has an opportunity to be like family to God's people, because David tries to extend an offer of peace to Hanun. However, this character acts like a deceptive snake and shames David's men. Now you may be thinking to yourself, that's a strange thing to do. Why would Hanun shave the hair and expose the backsides of David's men? I think this is a clear allusion to the Garden of Eden, where literally a snake deceived Adam and Eve, and that deception resulted in Adam and Eve realizing that they were naked and feeling shame. David's men have their nakedness exposed and also feel shame. Let's bring this back to Aram of the Double Rivers. Hanun adds another character who is snake-like and deceptive and who brings shame on the people of God. Oh, that was a long tangent. So when we encounter the name Cushan Double-Trouble, king of Aram of the Double Rivers, we understand what Aram of the Double Rivers, what that reference is to. We see that he's like this prototype of an amalgam of many of Israel's enemies, particularly the enemies who are associated with deception, familial betrayal, and opposition to God's people. Cushan really embodies the archetypal ultimate enemy of God's people. And here it is time for our first obligatory anime reference of the week. If you've ever watched the show Hunter x Hunter, there's a villain named Meruem, which means like ray of light in Japanese, I believe. In this show, this villain is made from a creature called a chimera ant. This is like a giant ant queen that will eat lots of different animals and organisms, and whatever organisms she eats, she merges their DNA with hers and creates a chimera-like creature. So eventually, in her life cycle, the queen of this colony of giant ants has to give birth to a king. So she eats lots of humans and other creatures and gives birth to this ultimate chimera ant, who is genetically superior to all the other ants she has birthed. To me, Cushan Double-Trouble, king of Aram of the Double Rivers, almost feels like a mixture between a lot of these deceptive characters and villains from Aram of the Double Rivers combined into one supervillain. He's like Meruem, the king of the chimera ants. I hope that made sense. Makes sense in my anime nerd brain. Okay, obligatory anime reference over. Back to Othniel. Othniel, the first judge in this second story, emerges as a foil to Cushan, although he's not as fleshed out of a character as later judges will be fleshed out as. Othniel embodies the essential characteristics of a judge. He's imbued with God's spirit. He leads Israel in battle, and he brings peace to the land for 40 years, which is a number of waiting and testing. This is fitting because Cushan represents the deceptive adversary who tests God's people and not only oppresses Israel, but also leads them astray from their God. Cushan and Othniel are like models for the villains and heroes to come in the book of Judges. This story is like a mold or formula for the stories to follow in Judges. Not that every judge will be exactly replicated like Othniel and Cushan. They're not going to fit in those molds exactly, but rather these two characters are like the stereotypical judge and oppressor, or you could say sheriff and villain of this book. So now we've covered the first judge, Othniel. We're going to get into the story of Ehud. I like to call him Ehud the Unifier. Okay, this is Judges 3, 12 through 15. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of Yahweh. So Yahweh strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done evil in the sight of Yahweh. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek. And he went and struck Israel, and they took possession of the city of the palm trees. And the sons of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gerah, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by his hand to Eglon, the king of Moab. Let's pause here because there's a few things worth noting. First of all, we can see that the pattern of Othniel emerges here again. Israel sins, and Yahweh raises up an enemy who oppresses them. Interestingly, though, Yahweh also raises up the deliverer to defeat that enemy that he also raised up. Ehud, this left-handed guy from the tribe of Benjamin, is the deliverer. Ehud's name means something like united or joined together. So this becomes significant when you look into the small detail that Ehud was left-handed. In Hebrew, this phrase is literally right hand impaired or impaired in his right hand. Now, I don't know if Ehud actually did have an injury or a defective right hand. I say this because this phrase right hand impaired is used one other time in this book, and that is at the end of the book, where there are also some valiant warriors from the same tribe as Ehud, Benjamin, who are also right hand impaired as well. I like to call these guys the legendary stone slingers of Benjamin. They're an elite troop of men with slingshots who are able to split a human hair with their slings. Like they're able to sling their stones and cut a hair in half. Pretty impressive. These stone slingers are not unifying Israel, but rather they are fighting with the rest of the 11 tribes in a bloody civil war at the end of the book. So the book of Judges starts with a Benjaminite who is right hand impaired and who saves Israel, whose name means unifier. But Judges then also ends with a group of right hand impaired Benjaminites, or Benjamites, however you say that, who help divide Israel in a civil war. I think this connection is here to help us to see the kind of degradation that the tribe of Benjamin and the saviors of Israel will go through. They will go from warriors and unifiers to villains and dividers. So that's Ehud's name and his tribe. What about the setting of the story? Well, the city of palms is another name for the city of Jericho. This is another apparent discrepancy in the chronology because Jericho was the first city destroyed during the conquest of Joshua. Not only that, Joshua places a curse on anyone who rebuilds the city. Jericho isn't explicitly said to be rebuilt as a city until all the way over in 1 Kings chapter 16. However, I should note that the story simply says that Eglon took possession of the city of palm trees. It doesn't say that he rebuilt the city, so maybe he's like camping in the ruins. I don't know. Maybe this is set before Jericho had fallen. We're not really told. I would like to focus here less on the city and more on Ehud's role in all of this a bit more. What is Ehud doing bringing tribute to King Eglon? I thought Ehud was supposed to be the hero of the story, so why is he the one going and giving this evil overlord the taxes from the people? I find this a bit strange, and it seems to me that Ehud may actually have been more of like a tax collector or an ambassador to the king, or at the very least, Ehud was somehow on good terms with King Eglon. This probably would not put Ehud on good terms with many of the Israelites. Okay, so our story is set. We have our characters in the setting. Let's keep going. Judges 3, verse 16. Now Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and strapped it on his right thigh under his cloak. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man, and it came about when he had finished presenting the tribute that Ehud sent away the people who had carried the tribute, but he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." And the king said, "Has," and all who were attending him left him. Then Ehud came to him while he was sitting in his cool roof chamber alone, and Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." And he got up from his seat. Then Ehud reached out with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. The hilt of his sword also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade because he did not pull out the sword out of his belly, and the filth came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule, shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locked them. Stop there. A few things to note here. First of all, it's pretty impressive that Ehud makes the assassination weapon himself. Like, this man literally made a blade. He was like a blacksmith, apparently. 2 cubits is about 17 inches. So this is like a pretty small sword. The fact that this is a double-edged sword may make one think that Ehud is planning out specifically how to kill Eglon. That is by stabbing him, right? So if it's double-edged sword, it's really good for stabbing. Single-edged swords are better for slashing. I should also note here that Ehud takes all this time to make and conceal this short double-edged sword. But when he has his first chance to kill the king by presenting the tribute to Eglon, he doesn't go through with it, right? So he makes his sword, plans all this stuff out, goes to the king, and then he doesn't kill him. Here it is time for my Bible conspiracy theory of the week. When I say Bible conspiracy theory, I just want to note I'm referring to a theory or interpretation that I have that I can't fully prove. I'm usually just something I have to make an educated guess on. Most of my Bible conspiracy theories are simply times when I try to guess the motives of the characters in these stories and what's going through their hearts and their minds. So here's my Bible conspiracy theory on what's going on here. Why did Ehud not kill Eglon the first time? Well, I think that Ehud didn't kill Eglon here because he hesitated. My theory is that Ehud individually planned to kill Eglon, didn't tell anyone about his plan, and when the time came for him to do the deed, when he brought the tribute the first time, he hesitated and he got scared. So let me explain this theory. Doesn't it seem weird that Ehud would go through all of this preparation and planning just to not kill the king when he brings the tribute? You could say that Ehud was planning on getting the king alone so he could make his getaway later. However, I would like to point out a few things. First of all, Ehud has an entourage with him presenting the tribute to the king. This would make sense because the tribute of an entire nation would be a lot of things. Additionally, it was probably in the form of animals, crops, and resources. It wasn't just money or cash, and they didn't have dollar bills back then. It was probably gold or silver or some kind of coin, right? So he needed a lot of people to bring the tribute to the king. I find it interesting that Ehud sends away all of these people after the tribute has been sent to the king. I also find it strange that he barges back into the king's presence and simply says, I have a secret message for the king. Couldn't Ehud have barged in at any time to tell the king that he had a secret message for him? Why not bring up the message privately when he was presenting the tribute the first time, right? And then there's the strange idols at Gilgal. This was the place where we are told that Ehud turned away from in order to go back to the king. So first of all, how did Ehud go from Jericho to Gilgal? Well, Gilgal is not too far away from Jericho. It's really close by, so it seems like Ehud sent the men away and was leaving Jericho to go home. But then it is at these idols at Gilgal that Ehud decides to turn back and carry out his assassination. Here would be a good time to give some more context on Gilgal. The name Gilgal means wheel or circle. Gilgal was the first place where Israel camped out when entering into the Promised Land. It is very close, in fact, to Jericho. This is the story where God parts the waters of the Jordan River and the Israelites all get circumcised and celebrate their first Passover in the Promised Land. As a side note here, the Israelites, when they get circumcised, right? And in that story in Joshua, there was this hill that is transliterated in most Bibles as Givath Ha-Arloth. It's a mouthful in Hebrew. It literally means the hill of the foreskins. This is probably a really unpleasant experience and very unpleasantly named hill. The symbolism here is important. Circumcision was the ritual which showed a man to be a part of the family of God. It was a symbol of one's sexual fidelity towards God and marked a man forever as being an Israelite. So not only do the Israelites all get circumcised here, but they also set up a really important national monument, which is called Gilgal. This monument was made up of 12 stones that while they were crossing the Jordan River, because God had parted the waters, one man from each of the 12 tribes picked up a stone from the bottom of the river as they were passing through it. And then they used those stones to build the monument, right? I mentioned the meaning of this name, but it's also worth mentioning the symbolism that Yahweh gives to this place, right? Gilgal means wheel or circle, right? It's composed of these 12 rocks. And this is the symbolism that God gives to Gilgal in Joshua 5, verse 9. Today I've rolled away the shame of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. So this was a place where Israel had their shame of being known as a people who are a group of slaves removed. They were no longer known as a group of slaves or a group of wandering desert nomads. This was the place where Israel would finally be independent and have a land of their own, where they would finally be a free nation. It is called Gilgal or Wheel because God rolled away their shame. But interestingly, as we can see in this story, Gilgal will also be a place in the Bible where Israel and certain characters in Israel will have their shame rolled away, or where they will also have their shame rolled back onto them because of their unwise decisions. So Gilgal is a place that is symbolic of the circular freedom from oppressors and sin, and also enslavement back to those oppressors and to that sin. This monument would be akin to the Statue of Liberty in America today. So, if that is the case, then why are these idols here at Gilgal? What are these idols doing here? Where do they come from? We don't have any stories even really about Gilgal from Joshua up until this story. So it's really only mentioned in Joshua, and that was like the first time it's coming back up again. It seems to me that there's an implication here that there may have been some foreign idols set up alongside the stone monument of Gilgal. This would be like a foreign nation invading America and hanging their flag over the Statue of Liberty. I think that this detail gives us a window into Ehud's heart and internal mindset. This little detail gives us some insight into what motivated Ehud to turn around and go through with the assassination of Eglon. I believe that Ehud made his sword, hid it under his cloak, planned out exactly how he would kill Eglon in front of the whole envoy and all the king's officials, but then when the moment came, Ehud hesitated and he couldn't go through with his plan. Then, when Ehud was on his way home and had already sent back the whole envoy, he looks up, and what does he see at this Israeli monument of independence but foreign idols? Was this the first time Ehud saw them? Were they set up by Eglon? We don't know. But it does seem like Ehud couldn't take this oppression and occupation anymore. So he turned back and decided to wing it and do whatever he needed to do in order to get the king alone. So Ehud goes back to Jericho. He barges into the king's presence and tells him, "I have a secret message for you, O king." Now this is interesting to me because first, it just seems like a dangerous thing to barge in on a king and tell him you have a secret message for him. Like, this whole display is really suspicious, right? It's really suspect. Didn't Eglon just see Ehud? Why couldn't Ehud have told the king earlier? Also, if it's so secret, why can't the king's advisors hear this message too, right? Like, Ehud's an Israelite. They're Moabites. Why shouldn't, the advisors know too? Eglon doesn't ask any of these questions. In fact, he does the opposite. He goes with it and completely believes Ehud. Eglon says, "Has." I've decided not to translate this word in this Hebrew word because it is an onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a word that is formed from the sound you want to create. So some examples of an onomatopoeia: sizzle, crackle, and shh. Has has the equivalent meaning to hush, shush, or shh in English. So this king simply says shh and then dismisses everyone in the room. He technically even cuts off Ehud from saying anything more about this secret message, right? He's like interrupting Ehud. "Oh, you have a secret message? Shush, shush, shush. Let me get everyone out," right? This tells me Eglon trusted Ehud. He was, after all, the man who was bringing him tribute every year. So there is some sort of backstory here that we're not privy to, where Ehud had somehow gotten on good terms with the king who was oppressing his own people. Now Ehud and the king find themselves alone on the roof of the king's chambers. And Ehud continues to try to get physically closer to the king without alerting the king, right? He tells Eglon, "I have a message from God for you." And Eglon is so excited and eager to hear about this message that he gets up from his throne and walks over to hear about it. And then Ehud stabs Eglon in the stomach. And we get this really grisly detail about how his fat eats up Ehud's blade, right? Then Ehud dies, and we get another really graphic note about how the filth came out. Now, I've heard that this actually does happen. where people die, like sometimes they literally poop themselves. What sort of allusion or message hidden in the Hebrew is in the details about Eglon's fat or the filth coming out? I don't actually think there is one. I actually think this is actually kind of meant to be comedic and funny. The only thing I will say here is that Eglon's name in Hebrew is really close to the Hebrew word egel, which means calf. Robert Altert said it way more eloquently than I ever could. Here he says that of Eglon's name, and the satiric view of the enemy, he, Eglon, is a gross, fatted calf ready for slaughter. Okay, so Ehud goes through with the assassination, then makes his escape, and locks the doors to the king's chamber on the way out. Let's keep going with the story. Judges 3, verse 24. When he had left, the king's servants came and saw, and look, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. And they said, undoubtedly, he's relieving himself in the cool room. So they waited until it would have been shameful to wait longer. But look, he did not open the doors of the roof chamber. So they took the key and opened them. And look, their master had fallen to the floor dead. Now Ehud escaped while they were hesitating, and he passed by the idols and escaped to Seirah. And when he arrived, he blasted the ram's horn in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country and was leading them. Then he said to them, pursue them, for Yahweh has handed your enemies, the Moabites, over to you. So they went down after him and took control of the crossing places of the Jordan opposite Moab and did not allow anyone to cross. They struck and killed about 10,000 Moabites at that time, all the stout and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was quiet for 80 years. Okay, so first I'd like to point out that the comedic detail about the filth or poop coming out of Eglon is now how Ehud actually makes his getaway. Surely this is also meant to be a comedic scene that leaves a lot up to the imagination. How long did they wait? Did they knock on the door? We aren't really, obviously they smelled the odor outside the door, right? Did they ask Eglon if he needed help? We aren't really told. But while the scene is going on, Ehud seizes the moment to rally Israel and to overthrow the Moabites. I want to note a few more things before we wrap up our time here. First, the Hebrew phrase, he blasted the ram's horn, is something more like he struck the ram's horn. That's because the Hebrew word used here is takah, and it means to strike an object or a person. Takah is the same word used to describe Ehud stabbing King Eglon. I think this is quite fitting, right? It brings attention to Ehud's two unifying actions, the killing of the oppressive king of Moab and the blasting of the ram's horn to unify and rally all of the tribes of Israel together to fight the Moabites. It seems like the authors are connecting the two actions in Ehud's story. They are essentially two blows that Ehud delivers to complete his coup. One was the singular assassination of the king while he's alone. The other was bringing together all of Israel and leading them in battle. How does Ehud the Unifier unify Israel? Well, in part by assassinating the king in the shadows, but also in part by rallying all of the tribes of Israel and leading them into battle, into the spotlight. It's also worth noting here that when we were told that the 10,000 Moabite men were killed, they were all stout and valiant men. The word stout literally means fat in Hebrew. So not only is the king like a fattened calf ready for slaughter, but all of his men are also fattened warriors ready for slaughter. That is the story of Ehud the Unifier and Othniel the son of Kenaz. I think my main takeaway from the story of Ehud is where are my idols? Maybe idols are not always just personal. Maybe there are idols in your church or your society as well as in your personal life. For Ehud, the idols at Gilgal represented both a turning point for him individually and also for the nation and people around him. It's like he was turning away from the national idols and also his personal idols of his fear of man at the same time, right? It's when he sees these idols that he stops being the king's vassal and finally does what he's planning to do, but has been too afraid to go through with for so long. I think Ehud presents us with a story of a man who is capable but hesitant, of somebody who is standing on the edge and looking for that signal to to take the leap of faith, but was too scared to take it for so long. I think Ehud was looking for an excuse to take a leap of faith, or maybe rather to take a stand for God and his people. That's all I got for you guys today. Thanks for listening. I'll see y'all next time.